Okay, thank you very much for that. And again, I'd like to start by thanking Klaus Dieter and everyone else responsible for organizing this, which has been a very, very rich discussion so far, and has reminded me of just how little I know about the rich, diverse world of Tibetan reception of Tathāgatagarbha, to which I can actually add very little. And in fact, some of what I have to say today is going to jar with quite a bit of this reception, but I beg your indulgence for the next 30 minutes or so. So as just mentioned, today I'm going to talk about some threads that run through my forthcoming monograph, that is the Buddhist Self on Tathāgatagarbha and Atman. So what I've been doing over the last few years is attending to the early history in Indian Buddhist literature of the expression Tathāgatagarbha, and the ideas for which it stands, and in particular, its associations with discourse about the self or Atman. I've been attending to all of the known Indian texts surviving in Sanskrit and then in Chinese and or Tibetan translation that present some kind of explanation of what we should understand by the expression Tathāgatagarbha. And this is, broadly speaking, the same Tathagatagarbha corpus that is identified by Takashi Jikido in his, I think, paradigm setting, 1974 Nyoraizo Shiso no Keisei, that is the study of the Tathagatagarbha idea or Tathagatagarbha thought. So in this slide are the core texts of the early Indian Tathagatagarbha corpus identified in Takashi's work. And these were all composed by the end of the 5th century at very, very, very latest. And these are our primary sources for understanding the early history of the expression Tathāgatagarbha in India and the idea or ideas for which it stands. And in my work, I make an important distinction between use of the expression Tathāgatagarbha, usage of which changes over the course of its literary history, and the underlying but also malleable idea to which this expression always refers. And this I call the Buddha nature idea, but note that I think that in an Indian context, it is a bit crude to say simply that Tathāgatagarbha means Buddha nature. It doesn't. The Buddha nature idea is that which is taught in one or other text by recourse to the expression Tathāgatagarbha. And this Buddha nature idea is, in my phrasing, that something proper to all sentient beings across their successive births and deaths is at all times that which is proper also to a Buddha. And this idea, crucially, can be understood and taught, as we know, in a number of different ways. In Takashi's work, he privileged 3 texts that are taken as major authorities by the great commentarial work in this tradition, the Ratnagotravibhaga Vyakya, with which I think everyone in the room is very familiar. These 3 texts, that is Takashi's so-called triple scriptures, are according to his own relative chronology the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, the Anunnatva Aparnatva Nidesha Parivarta, and the Srimala Devi Simhanada Sutra, which to save my voice I'm going to call simply the Srimala Sutra. Following Takashi, it had been generally accepted that the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra is the likely earliest text in this Tathāgatagarbha tradition, and we could refer here to Mikhail Zimmerman's still exemplary study of that text. The Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, along with these other 2 sutras on the left, and then along with the Ratnagotravibhaga and Vyakya, represented for Takashi something like the mainstream of Buddha nature thought in India. And aside from these, we have what Takashi presented as something of a tangent to this trajectory. Text in which the expression Tathāgatagarbha is used to refer to the presence of the permanent, unchanging, superlatively precious nature of the Buddha, in Sanskrit Buddha Dhatu. We find this in Tibetan sources articulated usually with Sangyeki Kam or Sangyeki Yin, and in Chinese with Fortsing, sometimes Forjie, but Jie here not in the sense of realm, but Dhatu in the sense of something contained, some element or essence. So these 3 texts, something of a tangent, Takashi thought, were the Mahaparinibbana Mahasutra, which I'm going to call, again to save my breath, Nirvana Sutra, the Angulimalya Sutra, and the Mahaberi or Mahabariharaka Sutra. These texts are conspicuous because all 3 not only use the expression Tathāgatagarbha to refer to the Buddha Dhatu, sometimes also Atma Dhatu, one's own essence, sometimes Swadhatu, again, something like one's own essence or nature, but they also contend that the Buddha's teaching about this constitutes the revelation of the self or Atman. Many scholars have over the years addressed whether or not texts of the Tathāgatagarbha corpus espouse something that warrants calling the self, that is, a permanent, unchanging kernel of a sentient being, that is also what is most valuable in their constitution. And this definition, I think, is important. What has been less discussed is the fact that three texts of this tradition, although we've already heard this today a few times, goes so far as to state explicitly that the Tathagatagarbha is the Buddha's account of the self, which sits in awkward tension with prior teachings about how important it is to overcome grasping to notions of self, atmagraha, or to eschew wider Indian philosophical discourse concerned with the self, that is what we could call atmavada discourse. In this slide, I present just one very clear example of atmavada in articulation of Tathagatagarbha. This is from the Tibetan version of the Nirvana Sutra. What is called the self means the Tathagatagarbha. The nature of the Buddha exists in every sentient being, but because it is obscured by all manner of afflictions, sentient beings cannot see within themselves its presence. These equations are pretty clear. The Nirvana, Angulimalya, and Mahabharata Sutras all share the same vocabulary when they articulate that in Tathagatagarbha, the Buddha reveals the true self, that is otherwise what is essential to a Buddha, that is his dhatu, in any sentient being. Here's another fun example. This is from the little-studied Mahabharata Sutra. The Tathagata is a god among gods. If parinirvana is a complete annihilation, the world will be gradually destroyed as Buddha's parinirvana disappear. But if it is not annihilation, then it is lasting and tranquil, something that this text keeps saying. Since it is lasting and tranquil, there certainly exists a self, just as where there is smoke, there is fire. So this experience of liberation could not be there if there were not something called the self already somehow about sentient beings. The Mahabharata defends the need for Tathagatagarbha, otherwise the self, if liberation proper to the Buddha could be anything but annihilation. And interesting, earlier today, Lama Shenpen referred to the example of gold that is being purified. The Mahabharata Sutra includes this image, and it talks about the Suvarna Dhatu, the element of the gold, being rid of its impurities. But what's being described there is called both Tathagatagarbha and Atman, consistently. So to Takasaki, this curious use of Tathagatagarbha to argue for something so contentious, even heretical as an account of the self, could have only been a misstep after the early life of the Buddha nature idea. To him, this was perhaps appropriation of Tathagatagarbha from the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, or a doctrinal inheritor, that proved ultimately unsuccessful in Indian discourse. However, we have some cause to rethink this trajectory. Here I group together these texts differently. My central thesis is that it is in fact the set of Atmavadin Tathāgatagarbha sources, now on the left, those that purposefully articulate Buddha nature as a teaching about the self, that are oldest, or at least represent the older mode of teaching about the expression Tathāgatagarbha in India. And evidence for this is plentiful. I'll talk today about three themes that develop through the Indian Tathāgatagarbha corpus from its inception as, in part, an account of something radical and transformational in the Mahayana, a Buddhist account of that which deserves to be called Atman. I'm going to move on from this slide now, but we'll return to it later. And if anyone is particularly perturbed by the absence of the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra here, please file that away, and once again we can deal with that later on. My revised model of the Tathāgatagarbha literature takes its lead from an important argument proposed by Michael Radich, first published in 2015 in his appropriately named The Mahaparinirvana Mahasutra and the Emergence of Tathāgatagarbha Doctrine. Radich argues that this text, the Nirvana Sutra, provides us with a persuasive scenario of origin for the emergence of the expression Tathāgatagarbha, and indeed for the Buddha nature idea for which it stands. And this, according to Radich, could take us back to Mahayanist innovations from as early as the 2nd century of the Common Era. With a debt to Shimoda Masahiro's study of the Nirvana Sutra and its likely composition, Radich argues that that text could be imagined as having been composed in 2 stages. What seems to be earlier content in the Nirvana Sutra shows no awareness of the expression Tathāgatagarbha, nor of any form of the Buddha nature idea. Once again, that sentient beings possess something of the Buddha somehow about or within them. Instead, the early material of the Nirvana Sutra concerns the transcendent mode of the Buddha's existence, his Dharmakaya, otherwise Vajrakaya, and its endurance beyond anything that is seen of the Buddha's physical body. This being the case, the Buddha must also exist beyond anything known of his physical body after his death. That is, the Buddha's relics, commonly Buddha Dhatu, that are thought to reside at any stupa. The stupa itself, across a wide range of Buddhist sources and inscriptions, can be called Tathāgatagarbha. That is, it has the chamber for the essence or element of the Buddha, a locus of the Buddha's enduring presence and power after his apparent demise. As befits the name of the text, the Nirvana Sutra is an account of the Buddha's death, but the twist is that the Buddha in this text never truly dies. He is not really entombed in any reliquary. Later material in the Nirvana Sutra introduces teaching about Buddha nature or Tathāgatagarbha and seems to be a continuation of this story. More orthodox accounts of the Buddha's death end with a description of the distribution of his bodily relics. But in this Mahayanist text, the distribution of relics, what is essential or most proper to a Buddha, again has a twist. Now the Buddha Dhatu is nothing strictly physical, but participates in the properly transcendent nature of the Buddha and resides in the body of every sentient being. And the language in this text is quite striking. It's in Tibetan we have rangi lu la, deshin shekme ningpo yo, and so on. It is in the body, repeatedly. This being the case, every sentient being possesses the Tathāgatagarbha, or Tathāgatagarbha, or chamber, also womb, containing a Buddha, but then also for the emergence of a Buddha. As Radich poetically writes, over the course of the composition of the Nirvana Sutra, tomb becomes womb. Otherwise, and unlike many other texts of this tradition, the Nirvana Sutra shows no clear evidence of knowing any other account of the Tathāgatagarbha. And by contrast, its fingerprints, conceptual and philological, can be seen in virtually every other text of this early tradition. Radich's argument for the chronological primacy of the Nirvana Sutra is, I think, persuasive. And his argument makes nothing of the fact that the text not only promotes but defends at some length that this Buddha Dhatu, otherwise Tathāgatagarbha, constitutes the Buddha's account of what could be called the self. The Nirvana Sutra and Angulimala Sutra, perhaps our earliest sources in this tradition, repeatedly acknowledge how contentious the revelation of Tathāgatagarbha is. On screen here are a list of objections that the Nirvana Sutra records. Here the Buddha's interlocutor, Kashyapa, issues this list of queries, or I think we can say complaints. He's shocked by what the Buddha is teaching. So this is from our Tibetan translation, and it's just paraphrasing. The Chinese versions give us something similar. So Kashyapa says, if there is a self, as the Buddha seems to be saying, a newborn child should not be able to acquire knowledge, but they do. Similarly, it should not be reasonable that one having been born could die. It would seem here that Dag, that is Atman, and Tathāgatagarbha or Tathāgatadhatu are used interchangeably. Despite there being Buddha nature, due to karma, there exist different rebirths. But if there is a self, there shouldn't be such differentiation. Because there is this nature, karma, no one should take up the path of different improper actions, but they do. And similarly, because we have the nature of a Buddha, when drinking alcohol, no one should become drunk. If there is, this time we seem to have sattva dhatu, the Chinese gives us something slightly different, there should be neither blindness, deafness, nor muteness. One has the nature of a Buddha, after all. And then finally, if there is a self, where is this thing? Is it amidst bodily humours? Does it reside in one place or pervade the body? And then if the body is injured, is somehow this self, or Tathāgatadhatu, somehow injured or crippled? In summary, the Nirvana, Angulimala, and Mahabharata Sutras show that Buddha nature, that is Buddha Dhatu, evokes the essence of a Buddha present at some stupa, now internalized at the chamber or womb for a Buddha, that is Tathāgatagarbha. This refers to a permanent, unchanging constituent of sentient beings, which these texts tell us cannot be killed or injured, that is somehow resident within the body. As such, and in contrast to worldly notions of such a thing, it can be articulated as the Buddha's account of the self or Atman. But this is not the case in other texts of the Tathāgatagarbha corpus. Apart from these texts on the left, which teach an Atmavadin articulation of Buddha nature, we have sources that Takasaki had taken to be earlier. The most important of these, I argue, is the Srimala Sutra. This is the text most quoted by the Ratnagotra Vibhaga Vyakya. Indeed, I think it gives it the its doctrinal backbone. And we can, I think, be quite sure that the Srimala Sutra knows the Nirvana Sutra, or at least ideas promoted by it. This is most telling where the Srimala Sutra states that Dharmakaya, the true mode of the Buddha's existence, is characterized by the perfection of permanence, bliss, self, and purity. This passage in the first half of this slide is quite well known. We've already heard it mentioned before. Note that this is not said of Tathāgatagarbha, but the Dharmakaya, which is Tathāgatagarbha rid of afflictions. Notably, the Nirvana Sutra also explains that what is supermundane can be characterized by permanence, bliss, self, and purity, a feature studied by both Takasaki and also Shimoda. So these are four qualities that earlier Buddhist teaching emphasized could not be attributed to any worldly dharma. While the Nirvana Sutra takes the more contentious position that these labels can describe something, the liberation of a Buddha, the Srimala Sutra does similar but qualifies that what must be spoken of in this context is the perfection of such and such. For example, Atma Paramita. This perhaps to avoid confusion with, for example, selfhood as known in the world. Otherwise, it is telling that the Shamala Sutra clarifies that Tathagatagarbha should not be confused for anything like a worldly self. We see this in the second half of the slide. It is no Atman, Sattva, Jiva, or Pudgala. And to be sure, similar statements are made in the Nirvana, Angulimalya, and Mahabharata Sutras. But in those texts, this is very necessary, because the Tathagatagarbha does indeed refer to some enduring constituent, which could be called the true self. It is telling that the Shamala Sutra contains this clarification, because what it teaches by the expression Tathagatagarbha does not, I believe, resemble anything much like a teaching about the self at all. And this being sensitive to how the term Atman is used in Indian literature concerned with Atman, either side of the turn of the Common Era. So here is a key passage from the Shamala Sutra explaining Tathagatagarbha. It is apart from the characteristics of what is conditioned. It is permanent and unchanging. Hence, it is the basis, support, and foundation. It is not separate, not apart from, not other, nor different to the inconceivable qualities of a Buddha. Lord Tathagatagarbha is the basis, support, foundation that is apart from, different to, outside of conditioned phenomena. And the Ratnagojavibhaga Vyakya quotes this, and it keeps for us the Sanskrit phrasing that the Shamala Sutra must have used, that is Nishaya Adara Pratistita, basis, support, foundation, for what is conditioned. Otherwise, with never any mention of an element, nor mention of any dhatu, nor any imagery of the stupa or reliquary that is found throughout the Nirvana Sutra and others, the Shamala Sutra makes an influential equation between Tathagatagarbha and the intrinsically pure mind. We see in this slide, first of all, the affirmation that the difference between Tathagatagarbha and Dharmakaya, the latter of which seems to be a collection of enigmatic supermundane qualities, is the presence of afflictions. Where are these also mentioned? The two teachings difficult to understand are that the mind is intrinsically pure and that the mind is defiled by afflictions. So as far as the Shamala Sutra is concerned, Tathagatagarbha cannot be confused for anything like a teaching about the self, because it really is not anything like a teaching about the self. If by this we mean some constituent of a sentient being, something worthy of searching for, discovering, and indeed seeing. Rather, Tathagatagarbha refers to the status of the mind. It describes not some element or constituent, not anything that sentient beings have or possess, but rather some aspect of them. This is in accord with how many more articulations of Buddhist teaching understand what a sentient being is, not in terms of physical entities, but in terms of strata of the mind. Forms of Buddhist Vijnanavada, by which I mean discourse about sentient beings understood in terms of the mind and its workings, so not specifically Yogacara Vijnanavada, can now be reconciled with Tathagatagarbha as not some precious, static, hidden entity, but a designator for the basic purity of the mind. And of course, this is what we find also in the Lankavatara Sutra, a text that knows the Shamala Sutra and by name the Nirvana and Angulimalya Sutras. It confronts head-on the wrong-minded idea that Tathagatagarbha refers to anything like a teaching of the self, and then equates this instead with the Alaya Vijnana, or substratum consciousness. And this is a development of what is found in the Shamala Sutra, as the text itself seems to concede. So let us now recap by taking two speedy journeys through this Tathagatagarbha corpus. First, attending to how Buddha nature says something about the self, and secondly, attending to how far Buddha nature is meant to refer to something about the mind. As far as the Nirvana, Angulimalya, and Mahabharata Sutras are concerned, Buddha nature, Buddha Dhatu, present at the chamber or womb for a Buddha, Tathāgatagarbha, refers to a permanent, unchanging constituent of sentient beings, somehow resident within the body. As such, and in contrast to worldly notions of such a thing, it can be articulated as the Buddha's account of the self, and related also to the status of the Buddha as the attainment of self, something that we find in what seems to be early content of the Nirvana Sutra. But in the Shamala Sutra and after it, the Tathagatagarbha cannot be articulated as a constituent element of a being, but instead refers to the originally pure status of the mind. The Shamala seems to have prakriti parishuddha chitta, that is itself permanent and enduring. As such, it is incorrect to conceive of Tathagatagarbha in terms of anything like a self. However, the true status of a Buddha, the Dharmakaya, could still be articulated enigmatically in terms of perfection of self, Atma Paramita. This is an inheritance from the Nirvana Sutra, still present in the Shamala and on into the Ratnagojavibhaga. And then finally, the Ratnagojavibhaga and Lankavatara, in subtly different ways, contend that it is wrong to teach Tathagatagarbha, referring now to the status of the mind, in terms of selfhood. Where the language of selfhood is used, this is explained to instead refer to, in fact, absence of self, or employed for some pedagogical purpose, but requires further explanation. And now what if we trace our way through this literature attending to Tathāgatagarbha understood in mentalistic terms? Neither the Nirvana Sutra nor Mahabharata Sutra show any interest in Tathāgatagarbha articulated in terms of the mind. If anything, these texts, and the Angulimala Sutra with them, set Tathāgatagarbha in opposition to constituents of the body. It is contrasted with the physical dhatus, or even in some instances the skandhas. And this model is what is criticized later in the Lankavatara. Curiously, the Angulimala Sutra fleetingly mentions Tathāgatagarbha vis-a-vis the pure nature of the mind, but only explains that this is what was taught for a Shravakayana audience. Its own account of Tathāgatagarbha, which in this text is also called Atma Dhatu, the Dhatu or essence that one has, is superior. In contrast to this, the Shramala, Anunatva Apanatva Nidesha, and Ratnakocha Vibhaga imagine Tathāgatagarbha to be no constituent of a sentient being, but to refer to the pure status of the mind. Otherwise, as we have seen, some basis, support, or foundation for the experience of transmigration and liberation from it. And this is language that is alien to our Atmavadin sources. And finally, the Lankavatara Sutra completes this reinvention of Tathāgatagarbha in mentalistic terms. It cites and approves what was taught in the Shramala Sutra, but explains further that Tathāgatagarbha is correctly understood as an epithet for the substratum consciousness or Alaya Vijnana. I have further evidence to support this revised trajectory of Buddha nature teaching in India. And in the time left, I'd like to run through one more argument for the primacy of this Atmavadin mode of its articulation, visible in the Nirvana, Angulimala, and Mahabharata Sutras. This is a bit more philologically slippery, but also illuminates the kind of hermeneutic problems anticipated or confronted by Buddhist authors who were introducing and defending something that is worthy of calling the self or Atman. There is no doubt in my mind that the most significant influence on the early Tathāgatagarbha tradition was the Saddharma Pundarika or Lotus Sutra, a text that may have been produced in the first couple of centuries of the Common Era, around the same time as Radich argues for the production of the Nirvana Sutra. Crucially, the Lotus Sutra and its teaching is mentioned by name in the Nirvana Sutra. The Angulimala and Shramala Sutras both offer explanations of teaching about the single vehicle, the great doctrinal revelation of the Lotus Sutra, about which more in a moment. The Mahabharata Sutra mentions this also, but more striking is that the Mahabharata Sutra reproduces two whole parables from the Lotus Sutra, and these are repurposed now to refer to teachings about Buddha nature. Without turning this into a lecture on the Lotus Sutra, let me say simply that the Lotus, in spite of its great influence in East Asia, was in India a radical, even revolutionary text, which was by no means accepted by many later sutra sources, nor a great many commentators or Buddhist philosophers. So we heard on the first day Professor Lopez say that the Mahayana might represent, for many centuries in India, the interests of the 1%. I would argue that maybe the Lotus Sutra and the Ekayana model for a while represented the 0.1%. It seems to have been a minority or an unpopular minority view in India for many centuries. The Lotus reveals not only that the Buddha exists beyond his physical appearances in the world, a theme prominent in the Nirvana, Angulimala, and Mahabharata Sutras, but also that the goals of Arhat and Pratyeka Buddha, accepted by mainstream and earlier Mahayanist thought, are not goals at all. According to the Lotus, there is only one mode of liberation possible, the complete awakening of a Buddha. And rather than three vehicles that lead sentient beings to three different modes of liberation, there is only a single vehicle, the Ekayana, otherwise Buddhayana or Mahayana, that leads all sentient beings very gradually to the status of a Buddha. Stay here for now. The Lotus is painfully aware that what it promotes is contentious and in tension with prior Buddhist teaching about what it is to be an Arhat, and indeed the ways in which the Buddha teaches. There has been much written about the emphasis in the Lotus on skill in means or skill in strategies or payakaushalya, but less on another, I think, very important term, the Buddha's use of samdabhashya or sandavachana. This is a very slippery term that has been understood variously as elusive speech, secret, mysterious, or cryptic speech or utterances. In this slide are some examples of this expression in the Lotus Sutra. Samdabhashya occurs 13 times in Kernan Nanjiro's Sanskrit edition, and Sandavachana occurs twice. And this is, I think, our earliest text to use this notion of samdabhashya, whatever quite it means, repeatedly to gloss what the Buddha is teaching. It is used to explain how the Buddha could have taught the reality of three vehicles, but how in fact he meant there was only one. In texts like the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha has to go, in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha has to go so far as to defend that he is not a mrishavadin, a liar. This is the weight of the term samda in this context. Also, this text refers to what the Buddha is teaching as a guhya, rahasya, or niguddha, that is, some secret that will be lost when monks forget the content of the Lotus Sutra. Throughout the Nirvana, Angulimala, and Mahabharata Sutras, we find repeated reference to the Buddha's use of samda utterances, surviving in some Sanskrit fragments and in our translations into Chinese and Tibetan. In our Chinese translations, this is normally understood to refer to some kind of secrecy. Tibetan translators could understand this a little differently, sometimes with gongpa or dempo. Sometimes it would seem communicating something like illusion or intent, but this does not capture, I think, the severity or gravity of this term in an Indian context. For example, the Nirvana Sutra defends the Buddha's use of sandavachana. The Buddha's interlocutor questions this category and asks whether this means that the Buddha kept a secret, guhya. Kashyapa compares the Buddha to a magician who tricks his audience with a marionette. The implied charge, if the Buddha has used sandavachana, is not something like allusion, but illusion. The charge is that the Buddha might have deceived an audience by not teaching them about Tathāgatagarbha. This has clear echoes of how the Buddha defends himself and his pedagogical strategies in the Lotus Sutra. The Nirvana Sutra treats us to a parable. The Buddha compares his actions to someone educating his son in grammar only after having taught him to distinguish between letters or aksharas. The Buddha explains that there is no keeping a secret, guhya, if an action is motivated by compassion. And here the similarity to the parable of the burning house in the Lotus Sutra is, I think, very evident. So this is one example of sandavachana surviving in a Sanskrit fragment of the Nirvana Sutra. We see in the Tibetan version of this Dongpe Tsig, again, likely reflecting sandavachana. Hang on, let me just see if I... Yes, sorry, this is what I'm looking at now. So sentient beings, being of the world, do not know the reality of the self. They are influenced by bad companions, ignorant of the sandavachana, so that while the self indeed exists, they cultivate absence of self. Notice here the Chinese gives us mijiao. It certainly translates with the sense of some secrecy. There seems to be fang bian here as well. I'm not sure whether this was something that might have been supplied in the act of translation. The Tibetan doesn't seem to use this in conjunction with something like sandavachana, nor do we find upaya sandavachana in our Sanskrit fragments. Another example now, this from the Angulimala Sutra, a fascinating text studied in particular by Takasaki and also by Kazokeno. Not understanding the secret or cryptic teachings or utterances of the Tathagata, you declare the Dharma to be absence of self, falling into the lamp of delusion like a moth that casts itself into a flame. So this enigmatic language is very reminiscent of the Lotus Sutra and its defense of its own controversial teachings. And this is found across our Atmavadin Tathagatagarbha sources. But whereas the Nirvana, Angulimala, and Mahabharata Sutras share this category samdabhashya, sandavachana, with the Lotus Sutra, this language is absent from other texts of the Tathagatagarbha corpus. The very notion that this constitutes a secret revealed by the Buddha is absent from the Shramala, from the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, Ratnakotavibhaga, and beyond. And with this in mind, one last run through this proposed trajectory of Tathagatagarbha thought in India, this time with recourse to this idea of some secrecy or cryptic utterance. Evidence of the expressions sandavachana or samdabhashya are found throughout the Nirvana, Angulimala, and Mahabharata Sutras, that is our Atmavadin sources. The Tathagatagarbha, otherwise the presence of Buddha Dhatu, otherwise the Buddha's account of the self, constitutes something like a secret teaching of the Buddha, and is repeatedly acknowledged to be in tension with the Buddha's teachings about absence of self. It is a clear concern to these texts that what they espouse looks like a contradiction of early pronouncements by the Buddha. But there is some precedent for their position that the Buddha is not always, it would seem, open-handed with his teachings. Perhaps our earliest Mahayanist text to rely on this notion of samdabhashya is the Lotus Sutra. Here, the Buddha's use of secret teachings refers to the revelation of the single vehicle, the problematic idea that there is in fact only one mode of liberation possible, the liberation of a Buddha. Importantly, the Lotus Sutra and this single vehicle paradigm of Buddhist soteriology is demonstrably known to all three of our Atmavadin Tathagatagarbha sources. The Shramala Sutra also accepts this single vehicle model and explains in some detail how there being only a single vehicle works in regards to Arhats and Pratyeka Buddhas. I argue this same paradigm is assumed by the Ananatva Aparanatva Nidesha, Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, and Ratnagotra Vibhaga, although the position of the Ratnagotra Vibhaga vis-a-vis this is a little bit confusing. In fact, at some points it would seem that this text instead promotes the Triyana model, but this is, I think, evidence of its distance from earlier Tathāgatagarbha sources. What is important is that across these texts, Tathagatagarbha is not introduced or defended as something really like a secret, so much as something that is unknowable to a sentient being, apart from through faith in the Buddha's teaching. In our Atmavadin sources, Buddha nature is something that clearly contrasts with teachings about not-self. In the Shamala onwards, Tathāgatagarbha instead complements Buddha's teachings about the innate purity of the mind. And I think it makes much more sense that later texts of this tradition would drop an air of secrecy, as the Tathāgatagarbha was reimagined into something more acceptable or palatable for wider audiences. The alternative would be that some authors introduce the idea that Tathāgatagarbha, an account of the self, was some kind of secret or something cryptic, an odd thing to bring in once this tradition was already extant. So, a summary of this. I'd argue that in its earliest available literary iterations, Tathāgatagarbha was a Buddhist account of that element that is permanent, unchanging, and superlatively valuable in the constitution of a sentient being. And it was articulated explicitly as the relocation of the Buddha's relic, otherwise his enduring essence, or the Buddha's account of the self. And I should note that the Nirvana Sutra does talk about the Bodhisattva making himself like a stupa, making himself an object of reverence for sentient beings. This, in its time, and perhaps also now, was radical. Our earliest sources testify to the contentious nature of what they're teaching. Our earliest sources regarding Tathāgatagarbha are also clearly heavily indebted to another earlier and just as radical Mahayanist text, the Siddhama Pundarika or Lotus Sutra. This affirms that there is only one vehicle of Buddhist soteriology, that which aims for all beings at the status of a Buddha. And therefore there is only one terminus of Buddhist practice or one mode of liberation possible, the completely awakened status of a Buddha. To be liberated requires that one be a Buddha, and this is a new idea in Indian Buddhism. The debt that early Tathāgatagarbha sources owe to the Lotus Sutra is clearest, where they contend that the ubiquity of Tathāgatagarbha, in tension with earlier teachings about absence of self, constitutes something like the Buddha's use of cryptic or secretive utterance, that is Samdabhashya or Sandavachana, an unusual and very tricky expression that the Lotus Sutra used with reference to its teachings about the single vehicle. Later Tathāgatagarbha sources do not refer to Buddha nature as being in any way problematic. It need be no secret to which the Buddha could only somehow cryptically allude, nor an account of the self, though this was central, I think, to the introduction of this teaching. In contrast, these later Tathāgatagarbha works, culminating in the Ratnagotra Vibhaga Vyakya and Lankavatara, reimagined Tathāgatagarbha to refer to the originally pure status of the mind. This is nothing controversial vis-a-vis earlier teachings, and nothing that resembles anything like an account of the self. And it is an idea that was far more palatable and became far more productive in the Indo-Tibetan Buddhist imagination of later centuries. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Any questions?
I think it's very interesting. Could you go back to like maybe the third or fourth slide where you have this citations from the Mahaparinirvana Sutra?
The problems.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. These are paraphrases, I should say. So I've communicated the terms in each of the problems, the term that the Tibetan text seems to reflect.
But it seems like you were arguing that the Mahaparinirvana Sutra is, describes the Tathāgatagarbha as the self, the enduring it. So, but this first and second one, so if there is a self, a newborn child should not be able. So that seems like opposite.
Sorry, these are the criticisms that Kashyapa is voicing to the Buddha, after the Buddha has said there is Tathāgatagarbha and it is the self. And Kashyapa says, but if there's a self, a newborn child should be able to do this. If there is this, then this is the case.
So this is all the Purvapaksh.
Sorry, this is all, yeah, in a sense, Purvapaksh, yeah. This is Kashyapa, his interlocutor, expressing surprise. What follows this, so just before this, we've had two short parables where the Buddha explains Tathāgatagarbha, that is the true self. In response to this, we get a series of further parables that are it would seem sort of trying to confront some of these objections, but not necessarily satisfactorily. But I think this is the text incorporating some criticisms or complaints that may have been either anticipated or heard very early on in its existence.
I see two very significant changes that occur from the time of the Mahaparinirvana Mahasutra to some of the later discussions of Buddha nature. One is to go from basically a container metaphor to the contained, within later traditions, it's very customary to talk about Buddha nature as that which is contained within the chaff or the husk. But the early sense of Garbha being a womb or a chamber suggests that it was actually what contains. So how do you see that?
Okay, you're inviting me to be more contentious again with this. Right. Looking at the Indian sources that I look at, I do not think I have seen an instance where Tathagatagarbha refers to is best understood as embryo or contained thing. It is the presence of the space within oneself. That's how I understand it. In what I think are the earlier texts, the claim is that one has Buddha Dhatu, which means also one has the space where the Dhatu is. That is the middle of the stupa that one has. When the stupa imagery is dropped, now Tathāgatagarbha, it's not clear, it's never described as something in you, it's described as the mind instead. I still don't think that in this instance Garbha is communicating a contained thing. I think the womb imagery, from what I've seen again, I'm strictly looking at the Indian texts here, I think the womb imagery is the dominant one. So the claim is that one one's mind is the womb for a Tathagata, in the space that it is the womb, it is the space where one encounters or from which emerges a Buddha in the world. The Shamala Sutra also contains things like Dharma Dhatu Garbha. It equates Tathāgatagarbha with Dharma Dhatu Garbha, Lokotra Dharma Garbha, Dharmakaya Garbha, and it doesn't make sense to me to say that it's the embryo of the Dharmakaya. Maybe it does make sense. But I still think that it has the sense of a space from which something emerges, I think.
Okay, and the second point is just the transformation from materiality to something that's non-physical or even mind.
Yeah.
Do you see that as happening within the early group of texts?
Well, these early texts don't show any interest in the mind. There are afflictions that obscure the Tathāgatagarbha, but they're not glossed as mental afflictions. We normally take for granted that's the way that they're discussed. But the mind is not something that's really discussed. And I'd say the same of the Lotus Sutra, that I can see sort of lurking behind these texts to some extent. We generally assume that, lots of Indian Buddhist texts will focus on sentient beings understood in mentalistic terms. Some form of Vijnanavada discourse. That's how we talk about what beings are. But not every Buddhist text does this. Quite often they do focus on the body and the corporeal being and the bodhisattva's practice without so much talk about the mind. Not that these things aren't incompatible, but there are texts that focus on, that take a different perspective. And I think our earlier Buddhist Buddha nature tradition is more in accord with that, I think.
Okay, and in the Nirvana Sutra, it actually is a physical object that has a certain
Well, it's in the body, and the fun thing about this and the Angulimala is they use Upanishadic imagery and then reject it by saying, you'll hear talk about a self that's the size of a millet grain, the size of a thumb, that's in the body. It's none of those things, and yet it's indestructible, in the body somewhere, and if we clean it, and also it's amidst 25 types of existence. And so it's they're walking a fine line by articulating something that has I hesitate, but yeah, Upanishadic undertones or overtones, but is definitely not these worldly accounts. It's the Buddha's account of what could be called Atman. Please.
Well, Michael, please correct me if I'm wrong, but did you observe that Garbha at the end of a compound, is having the nature of X, X Garbha? So that would mean, like if it's about really describing sattva, so sentient beings have Tathāgata as their nature.
As their nature. So this return to the early point about this being used differently in different texts. So in our Mahaparinirvana group, we find Tathāgatagarbha asti referring to the thing inside you, So what does one mean by that? So the suggestion is that is sort of, it's standing for the presence of Buddha Dhatu. So it could be that which has is the container for Tathagata, meaning something like an internalized stupa. One has within oneself the space where there is the Tathagata, or again, this could be glossed as, and we find this in the Astasahasrika, Tathāgatagarbha. So within oneself is the space where there is Buddha Dhatu. That's how I understand it.
Just to get you right, that would be restricted to the Mahaparinibbana Sutra?
And the Angulimala and the Mahabharati.
Okay.
And also actually though, portions of the Ratnakota I think. I'd have to double check that, but within the verses, you do find Buddha. Do you find Buddha? Maybe not. I'll come back to you. It's definitely the case with those three texts. Yeah.
So don't you have in the Mahaparinibbana Sutra also illustrations which similar to the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra somehow let you think of some growing, developing process? Like I remember there was one illustration of milk which turns then into cream, and somehow the essence is already there but in a different form. So that would basically also suggest that Garbha could be interpreted in that. And I don't know it good enough if that is a passage
In the sense of
embryonic state which develops into something complete. I'll talk tomorrow about this double meaning of Garbha in the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra. But if I understand you correctly, you would say there is no embryonic connotation of Garbha.
I think we're with the milk analogy, and I can't remember how it's framed, which is the important thing in all of this. The claim might be that we ourselves can be developed in this fashion, but what is present there, the dhatu, is something that's already realized. So, I have not seen an example where Tathāgatagarbha is the thing that is being developed, if that makes sense. It's obviously related to the idea that we have to do something to ourselves, but what is already there is realized, and this has to be cleansed away, cleaned in some fashion for it to be revealed. As I think you argued in another article, there is this model of disclosure in all of this that I think that dominates this literature. It's about something there being revealed. But again, by the time we hit the Shramala, I think we're different. And with the Tathāgatagarbha Sutra, well, complex.
Well, I've got one more.
Go ahead, yeah, please.
Use the word docetism at all.
Okay.
Michael Raddick uses it
Yeah.
a lot, but just thinking this process of the human being containing within them the medium for which a Buddha can be born does sort of lead the imagination to think that there's a kind of docetic thing going on.
If people, thank you. I mean, I should evangelize for Michael a bit more with this, I think. If people are interested in this material, the starting point is Michael Radich's book from 2015, where he talks about the possible scenario of origin for Tathāgatagarbha. One aspect of this is that in the early centuries of the Common Era, we find texts that are uncomfortable with the idea that a Buddha could emerge from a physical womb or from a physical human being and the mucky process of normal gestation. And these are the same texts that refer to the Buddha projecting docetically his birth and so on and so forth. Tathāgatagarbha, that starts out as an account of where the Buddha's nature is, that is in something like an internalized stupa, now gives an account of docetically, if you like, in a super mundane fashion, how Buddhas can emerge from sentient beings. Because we have the womb, because Garbha can mean womb in this context as well, that's what's going on, tomb becoming womb. We have now a different model for how Buddhas come into the world that tries to avoid reference to what various Buddhist texts refer to as the sort of difficult and yes, unpleasant, polluted business of the Bodhisattva being physically born, which is something that a lot of Buddhist texts from the early centuries of the Common Era are uncomfortable with, it would seem. Oh. No. I don't think so. In the Indian context, so Sugatagarbha is present in the Ratnakota in a couple of places. Who knows in these translations that we have in Chinese and Tibetan whether Sugatagarbha was extant in those texts? I mean, we can't tell. They're using Rulai Tsang and we don't know. Is there not? Okay, right, it's not there. And there's Jinagarbha and there's another one, but not Sugatagarbha. But I don't see a distinction, no. Thank you.